German Chancellor Angela Merkel visits the White House while US Secretary of State Rex Tillerson tours Asia. Dutch voters face the rise of the far right, and US President Trump's travel ban faces yet another legal setback. All this and more on our Reporters Roundtable. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C., and this is The Heat. After a brief weather delay, German Chancellor Angela Merkel meets with President Trump at the White House. US Secretary of State Rex Tillerson continues his tour of Asia. Dutch elections confront a rise of populism in the West, and US President Trump's travel ban faces a major legal hurdle. To explore this week's biggest headlines, we're joined now by Afshin Molavi. He is co-director of the Emerge 85 Lab and editor of the New Silk Road Monitor. From Beijing, Peng is a correspondent with CGTN, and from Brussels, Dave Keating is an international journalist focused on European politics. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Afshin, let's start in the studio. Yes. So the German Chancellor, Angela Merkel, was in town, had a meeting with President Trump. Conversation, as we understood it, ranged from NATO to trade. No big surprises, but there was a show of unity at their joint press conference. What did you make of it?
Well, you know, this has been a strained relationship, as you know, Anand. In fact, on the campaign trail, then candidate Trump said that Angela Merkel is ruining the country. Said that, her policy of allowing in 1 million or so migrants is, endangering Germany. And after his election, Angela Merkel offered a very, famous congratulatory note that wasn't quite a congratulatory, statement. So it was a strained relationship, but it's an important relationship. And also, President Trump has been, as they say here in America, working the refs on the trade deficit. The U.S. has a $65 billion trade deficit with Germany. Angela Merkel has been more pro-globalization, more pro-free trade. So this show of unity matters. It matters a great deal because Germany, in many ways, is such an important linchpin in not only Europe, but in the global economy. And for Germany and the United States to be at loggerheads, that's not good for a global economy that is facing sluggish growth.
Right, so diplomatically, I guess, Afshin, they managed to repair that rupture.
Yes, I think so. And time will tell, of course, because we sometimes see Donald Trump in these settings seem to get on well with someone. The classic example was his meetings with President Barack Obama shortly after the election, and they seemed to get on very well. And it didn't take long for him to accuse the former president of wiretapping him. Okay,
let's go to Dave Keating. He's in Brussels. Dave, of course, trade was discussed, as Afshin points out. It is a major issue for both the United States and for Germany. But we've been hearing from European politicians, and there is some concern with Trump's America First policy. Let's take it. He was asked about that at the news conference. Let's take a listen to what he said.
I don't believe in an isolationist policy, but I also believe a policy of trade should be a fair policy. And the United States has been treated very, very unfairly by many countries over the years, and that's going to stop. But I'm not an isolationist. I'm a free trader, but I'm also a fair trader.
So listening to that, Dave, will that in some way assure the Europeans that the Americans are not going to totally go it alone?
Well, we'll see. I mean, I think that there was some hope here in Brussels that actually Angela Merkel might be able to persuade him to come back to the table on TTIP, which is this free trade agreement between the EU and the US. But judging from their body language at the press conference today, it didn't look very friendly, to say the least. There was this whole kind of kerfuffle over the handshake. The German journalist asked Trump if he would shake Angela Merkel's hand, and he just didn't respond, didn't look at her. So there are a lot of people here who really want to see this relationship, which, as you mentioned, is quite strained. They want to see this get healthier because, trade with the United States is a very important aspect of the economy here. But signs so far don't make people feel very hopeful that that's going to happen.
And Dave, I guess, Angela Merkel came here to the United States to see Trump. She doesn't just represent Germany in a sense, she represents Europe, doesn't she? So to what extent were other European leaders watching this summit very closely to see what comes of it?
Yeah, Angela Merkel is certainly viewed as the most powerful leader in Europe. There is a sense when she's abroad that when she speaks, she is speaking for Europe to some extent. So there's also a lot of pressure on her at the moment. There was a headline in the European version of Politico today which said, today the leader of the free world is meeting with Donald Trump. There is this mantle being attached to her as the kind of last defender of liberal democracy. So there are many leaders in Europe who are looking at her. They want her to smooth over the relationship with Trump, but at the same time, they want her to stand up for European values, stand up for democratic values, and to also stress upon Trump the importance of Europe to the United States.
Right, that mantle that you talk about, leader of the free world, attached to Angela Merkel very reluctantly, we understand. Let's go to Han Peng in Beijing. Han Peng, another big issue for these two leaders, climate change. Germany is, of course, a big supporter of the Paris Accord, but President Trump is not a big supporter of that. And in fact, at one stage, he threatened to pull out of the deal altogether. So is China working with other countries like Germany, other European countries, to try and persuade Donald Trump of the dangers of climate change and global warming?
Well, Angela Merkel had said before her visit that she will tell Trump that she believes the climate change is certainly caused by human beings. On the U.S. side, however, the position is still not very clear. Donald Trump used to say that climate change is a hoax invented by the Chinese, which, by the way, is very bizarre for the Chinese public because some Chinese used to believe that it was a hoax invented by the United States in an attempt to slow down China's industrialization. But after Trump's inauguration, he somehow changed his rhetoric on this, though he's still not very clear on the position. Many Chinese are closely watching Merkel's meeting with Trump and hope to see how the two leaders will make their statement and on their positions, whether to honor the Paris Agreement. Many Chinese believe that the deal is a hard-won compromise between the developed and the developing countries on their respective shares of responsibility over climate change and hope that this deal will not derail.
Afshin, getting back to the news conference, there was one remarkable moment when those two leaders were standing there before the press when Trump was asked by a German journalist about his claims that British intelligence had been monitoring him before the election, or his building, Trump Tower in New York. He appeared to make light of it. Let's take a listen to what he said.
As far as wiretapping, I guess, by this past administration, at least we have something in common, perhaps.
So on the one hand, a very slick answer, but it didn't address what is a very serious allegation that he's making.
It's a very serious allegation, and it's his pattern to make these allegations and then to dig in when he's questioned about the allegation. And if you could see, if the tape rolled, you would have seen that Angela Merkel was not amused, by the statement as well. But because Angela Merkel also wanted to show in this visit and wanted to get away from those kind of showmanship, she wanted to show. If you look at who she brought with her delegation. She brought the CEO of BMW, the CEO of Siemens. Now, BMW is a major investor in the United States. In fact, BMW manufactures so many cars in the United States that they're the largest single car exporter from the United States around the world.
Right.
So she wanted to show that there's a real economic relationship here and didn't want to get involved in that sort of thing.
Yeah. Han Peng, let's move on to the visit by U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson to Asia. He will be in China Saturday. What is the focus of the visit? What is he going to be talking to Chinese leaders about?
Well, we're expecting Tillerson's visit to be a preparation of the meeting between President Xi Jinping and President Donald Trump. But in order to clear the path for a Xi-Trump meeting, Tillerson's visit has to deal with several major disagreements between China and U.S. Korean Peninsula is definitely on the top. He just wrapped up his visit in Seoul and Tokyo and said in Seoul that, quote, all options are on the table to stop the DPRK from the nuclear and missile tests. For the Chinese, it's a thinly veiled threat of military actions against the DPRK. Just last week, China has proposed a two-stage solution to calm down the crisis on the peninsula. First, the DPRK must stop the test, and then secondly, the U.S. and South Korea must halt military drills against the North. It is a peaceful one, but it seems that the U.S. has a different approach, and we'll see what Tillerson and Chinese leaders will say on this.
Right, that's the so-called double suspension that was proposed by China. Dave, I have to ask you about this, and that is, in what is quite a departure from normal practice, Tillerson is traveling to Asia with only one U.S. correspondent. That doesn't happen very often. Not too much fanfare during this visit. What do you make of something like that, you know, when you are out there as an international journalist?
Well, it is kind of consistent with the way the White House has been behaving towards journalists in general, kind of picking certain news media outlets that are more friendly and telling them information, not telling it to others, holding briefings where they only invite certain news agencies. But I think at the same time, so in one sense it does reflect this particular news organization is a friendly one to Trump, and that's who they bring along. But also the fact that it's only this one news outlet shows that this particular visit doesn't seem to be of high import. And perhaps Tillerson himself is not of high import within the administration. There's been a lot of rumors going around that he is being majorly sidelined. This comes at the same time that Trump is thinking about massively scaling down the State Department. So there's a lot of intrigue going on with Tillerson's role within the administration, and that may be reflected by the low media presence on this trip.
Afshin, let's get back to the visit of Rex Tillerson to China. There are major issues, as Han Peng pointed out, that he will be discussing. They will discuss the South China Sea, no doubt, the THAAD anti-missile system, which the U.S. wants to deploy in South Korea, and of course the missile and nuclear program with the DPRK. And on that particular issue, this is what Rex Tillerson had to say. Let's watch this.
Well, I think it's important to recognize that the diplomatic and other efforts of the past 20 years to bring North Korea to a point of denuclearization have failed. So we have 20 years of failed approach. In the face of this ever-escalating threat, it is clear that a different approach is required. Part of the purpose of my visit to the region is to exchange views on a new approach.
So he actually said that what he called strategic patience. Strategic patience has run out. There is a new approach. Now, part of that new approach that he has mentioned, he said that a military option is not off the table. So what could this new approach be? What does he mean by that?
You know, it's hard to tell. I mean, you know, on the one hand, could this be the art of the deal? Could this be you raise the stakes very high and then you're willing to come down a little bit from the, you know, but having said that, it's not, you know, clear that, you know, Kim Jong-un has ever read The Art of the Deal, you know, so to speak. And I think this visit to China is going to be very important because one of the things that has been clear and the message has been sent both from the previous administration to the Trump administration, and when you talk to Trump administration officials, they actually do view the North Korea nuclear threat as the primary foreign and security policy focus on their table right now, the one that is the most immediate. And as we know from Donald Trump's tweets, they think that Beijing has not been helpful. And so this question of North Korea is going to loom very large in Rex Tillerson's meeting in Beijing.
Well, as I say, they would have their work cut out because the Chinese have come up with one proposal, this so-called double suspension proposal that Han Peng was talking about, that the DPRK stop its tests and the United States and South Korea will stop their joint exercises. The U.S. initially turned that down.
Right. And not only that, the maximalist position of you have to end it and then we'll begin negotiating with you, in my view, that's really a non-starter.
Okay, Dave, let's move on to the elections in Holland. The Dutch have voted in a national election. There were fears, of course, that the party of the extreme right, the party of Geert Wilders, would do well, but that did not live up to expectations. This is what the Dutch Prime Minister, Mark Rutte, had to say after the ballots had been counted.
It is an evening in which the Netherlands, after Brexit, after the American elections, said halt against the wrong sort of populism.
So all kinds of fears, not just in Europe, but in other parts of the world as well, that Holland might go the same way, move to the far right. That didn't happen. Have the Dutch effectively put the brakes on this wave of populism that we saw in Europe?
Well, I think that could be overstated. Certainly here in Brussels and other European capitals, people are feeling a huge sense of relief right now after this election. It was the first in a series of elections in continental Europe. We have France coming up, we have Germany, and most likely Italy. At the same time, the degree that the meaning of the Dutch vote could have been overstated, even if Geert Wilders party had come first, he still wouldn't have had more than probably 20% at the most, even if he had come first, and there was no prospect of him becoming prime minister. The real election that everyone's watching is France. The first round of that will be in April, and the second round will be in May. France has a presidential system, just like the United States, which makes it different than almost all other European Union countries. So that means if Le Pen wins, she really wins. I mean, she is president of France, and she is, well, certainly very anti-EU, and also has very different views on immigration. And so the Dutch election is hopeful. It's a hopeful sign, but people know that the real test is coming in 2 months.